So on page 18, he lays out the arguments that he wishes to make in the book, and I thought it would be helpful if we just go over these real quick because I think it captures the heart of what he's trying to do. So on page 18, he says that one argument that he's going to make in this book is that, quote, the very notion that a rational agent in full possession of his or her faculties could, in any meaningful sense, freely reject God absolutely and forever. That notion, he says, is a logically incoherent one. So he thinks that of course, for anybody to make a sense worthy of punishment, it would have to be a rational decision. They'd have to be in full control of all the rational capabilities, thus making them morally culpable for their actions. Well, he says, look, yeah, that's true. You have to be, well, we only punish someone for a crime if we can prove that they had, that they were in their right mind when they did it. I mean, we don't punish people who've got mental illnesses for doing things. No, I mean, why? Because they weren't acting rationally. They couldn't act rationally. And so what he's going to say is, in order for someone to actually go to hell forever, it would have to be a rational decision that they make. But he thinks, and he argues in his book, that he thinks that to posit that a rational creature would choose an eternity without God after encountering God fully and knowing God completely is just logically incoherent. You're not to not choose God is irrational. Well, if it's irrational, then how can you be eternally punished for it? Now, he does believe in hell, so DBH thinks that there is a hell of some sort that is remedial in nature, meaning it's going to help people come to their senses, right? It's going to purge them, right? You see this, of course, a little bit in some of Gregory of Nyssa's thought on the soul and the resurrection, right? So it's that remedial idea of hell and judgment. All right, number two, another thing he's going to argue for is he says, again, page 18, he says, for this and other reasons, a final state of eternal torment could be neither a just sentence pronounced upon nor a just fate suffered by a finite being, no matter how depraved that being might have become. So he's going to talk about the nature of God's justice. How could God send someone to an eternal hell if they chose that without reason, right? Or without full rational capabilities and without full use of their reasoning, right? Because he thinks, again, that you can't not choose God, or no, I'm sorry, he doesn't. He thinks that you can't choose a life away from God in a fully rational way. That's irrational. Well, if God were to sentence that person for making an irrational choice to an eternity of hell, then God's justice is just nonsense at this point. You can't even say God is just, because that'd be like sending someone to prison for the rest of their life for doing a crime that they did when they had a mental illness or something, right? That's sort of the logic that he's going by. So that's another argument. He wants to, number three, say that even if that fate were in some purely abstract sense just, so even if that situation was a just act, the God who would permit it to become anyone's actual fate could never be perfectly good, or rather, as Christian metaphysical tradition obliges us to phrase it, could never be absolute goodness as such, but could be at most only a relative calculable good in relation to other relative calculable goods. So the idea here is that, and he's going to develop this argument later, if he wants you to take the Christian metaphysical tradition seriously, that God is absolute goodness, and how could absolute goodness even permit someone to go to hell in the first place, right? That could actually happen. Now, someone could raise their hands in objection and say, oh, well, look, yeah, it's a bad thing that they've gone to hell, but a greater good is that they had freedom to choose, and freedom is a great good, and it's perhaps the greatest good or something. And he's going to push back and say, wow, you don't want to use these greater good arguments because it collapses, essentially, he thinks, a metaphysics of the absolute good and so forth. He'll develop this later on, and as I read him, we'll talk about that. Lastly, he wants to argue that Well, he says this. He says, and yet another argument that he wants to make is that the traditional doctrine of hell's perpetuity or perpetuity renders other aspects of the tradition, such as Orthodox Christology or the eschatological claims of the Apostle Paul, ultimately meaningless. So he's going to go into some of this. He's going to bring in Paul and Paul's ideas of judgment through the fires and how that's not eternal judgment, he thinks, but it's but it's more remedial and things like that. But this kind of lays the landscape and shows us where DBH is heading, and he's just being completely forthright and brutally honest, and along the way we'll be able to trace why he thinks these sorts of things. On pages 27 and 28, DBH asks a very important question, and I'm glad he asked this question. And the question is this: and is it even possible that a person could refuse God's love for eternity while they are still, in any significant sense of the word, free? Because again, many arguments for the concept of hell is that, well, hell's locked from the inside, the famous C.S. Lewis quote, and hell can be logically coherent if you have people who are choosing to stay there, or they are willfully and rationally choosing that position in hell, as opposed to wanting to be with God or something like that. And DBH is going to stop a person and say, well, look, is that even possible? Can you be truly free, perfectly free, and sustain an eternal rejection of God's love? Can you reject God's love forever and still be, in any meaningful sense, free? But then he ups the ante a little bit. He says, page 27, 28, he says, could God still be called good in any, quote, ultimate sense? And his act of creation good in a final sense? Can God's creation be considered good, or is it a massive failure or something in that sense, right? So he says, if the, quote, eternal loss of any soul to endless sorrow were a real possibility, then we really have to question the goodness of creation itself, and we have to question the goodness of God, and we have to question the logical question of, well, can a person freely choose hell for all eternity? Can they be, in other words, perfectly free and still choose hell for all eternity? And he sums it up. He says, it seems quite clear to me that the only possible sensible answer to that question, not to belabor the issue, he says, is an unambiguous no. So he said, no, this is nonsense. None of these are even possible. I'm going to say no. I think they are possible. I think he's too dismissive of other viewpoints here, and I think it is possible that a person could sustain a rejection of God's love for all eternity. And the other thing I'm going to say, and I'm going to say this in just a few moments down the road here, but I don't think what is required is perfect freedom. I think what is required to sustain an eternal rejection of God's love for all eternity, that was redundant, but you know what I mean. I think all that is needed is not perfect freedom, but sufficient freedom. And I'm going to nuance that just a little bit here. So I want to quickly move to looks like page 43, 44. This is where he's going to be talking about something I find very interesting, and I think he may be wrong on. Page 43 is a section where he starts talking about the conjunction of justice, God's justice, and eternal punishment. He says that basically any conjunction of those two items, God's punishment, eternal punishment on one hand, and God's justice on the other, any conjoining of those two things is just to render God's justice unintelligible. And because he thinks that, and you see this on page 44, well, go back to page 43. It's interesting. He says that none of this should need to be saying, to be honest, and that's referring to the conversation he had above. But he says we should all already know that whenever the terms justice and eternal punishment are set side by side as if they were logically compatible, the boundaries of the rational have been violated. That's an interesting way to put it. But nonetheless, he just simply thinks that the very concept of eternal punishment is just incoherent and nuts. And he gives his reasons on page 44, 45 as to why he thinks so. So near the top of page 44, he says, from the perspective of Christian belief, the very notion of a punishment that is not intended ultimately to be remedial is morally dubious. And skipping down, he says that no rejection of God on the part of the rational soul is possible apart from some quantum of ignorance and misapprehension and personal damage. We would certainly expect divine justice to express itself in a punishment that is properly educative and therefore conducive to moral reform. Okay, so let's stop here. Basically, what DBH thinks is that every act of sin involves an element of ignorance, an element of the irrational. Nobody in his mind, in his metaphysic, does he think can actually rationally choose anything but God. You only rationally choose God because we were created for God, and He is the proper end of all things, right? And us being finite creatures, we will always find our end in God. And so anytime that we choose sin in this life, in the present age, we do so out of ignorance or out of misapprehension, he says, or out of some moment of irrationality, and that's the cause for our sin. So, for example, when you sin, you're not choosing it on its own. You're not choosing sin because it's sin. You're not choosing sin because it's evil. No one, he says, chooses evil for the sake of evil. Rather, we choose evil when we've been tempted by it, when we falsely and ignorantly think that thing, that sin, is a good for us. In other words, what I think he's saying here, I could be wrong, but what I think he's saying is that we always choose what we think is good. Because as creatures created by the absolute good, we are always programmed to grasp and choose that which is good. And sin is the reality of when we are deceived into thinking something non-good is actually good. So, for example, adultery. People commit adultery not because they think it's going to hurt them, no, because they think it's something good for them in that moment. Now that's obviously not true. That's obviously wrong, but that's an example of how a person can choose sin, mistakenly, ignorantly thinking that it's actually some sort of good for them, when in fact it's not. And that's the nature of sin. It's deceptive. It's just purely deceptive. But his point here is that all sin involves misapprehension. All sin involves ignorance on some level of irrationality. Well, if that's the case, then when God punishes, or whatever word we want to use there, whenever God punishes for our sin, then that punishment necessarily has to be remedial. It has to be out for our reform. There's no such thing in DBH's worldview for God to punish for the sake of punishment. It's always remedial in nature. And so it's always a judgment that seeks to bring the person back to God and to purge them of their sin and purge them of their irrationality. Otherwise, you've mocked God's justice. Why would God eternally punish somebody if their sin, being what it is, that is as an act of irrationality, an act of ignorance? Why would God eternally punish somebody for doing something ignorantly, right? So again, I hold my comments here, what I think about that, but that's his view, and I'm just trying to summarize his view. So he goes on page 44, toward the top middle, he says, even if one believes that Christianity makes room for the condign imposition of purely retributive punishments, it remains the case that a retribution consisting in unending suffering imposed as a recompense for the actions of a finite intellect and will must be by any sound definition disproportionate, unjust, and at the last nothing more than an expression of sheer pointless cruelty. Okay, so again he says that basically an infinite punishment for a finite creature is just repugnant and it's cruel. He goes on, he says that, of course, some people try to respond to that objection, right? And he wants to talk about this. He says the most august of these is the claim that the guilt for any crime must be measured not by the intention of the criminal, but solely by the dignity of the one offended against. And this supposedly explains things adequately, because God is infinite and infinitely good and infinitely worthy of obedience and love, and so, well, he says you can fill in the rest. So, just to recap here, people have often said, and I've heard this a lot, that That the reason God can consign you to an eternal punishment if you reject him, even though you're a finite creature, the reason God can do that is because you've offended an infinite God, an infinite holy God. Therefore, the punishment must meet and be compatible with that infinite offense, right? And the only punishment, of course, is an infinite one, an infinite punishment. So how I take DBH here is his response to that is that we have to take into account the intentions of the person committing the sin or the crime, as well as the objective nature of the crime committed, right? And this is just basic conceptions of law and order, justice, and so forth, right? But again, he comes back, he says, look, because everybody commits sin ignorantly or through misapprehension, and because nobody actually sins against God with full rational capability, or what he calls perfect culpability, such justice of an eternal punishment would be no justice at all, he says. And that's really interesting, right? I find that really interesting. So it seems that here, and this is where I'm going to offer a little pushback, it seems that here in order for eternal punishment to work under his view, it requires, quote, perfect culpability of the sinner. Okay, yeah, that I'm not sure about that. I want to muse on this more, and I appreciate him bringing this up, but I definitely want to offer some initial thoughts here. Essentially, what I think is I'm not convinced you have to have perfect culpability. So I might be on board with the idea that all sin is irrational, that all sin involves ignorance of some sort. I might be on board with that, and I think maybe he makes a good case for that elsewhere, previously in his book, before I think page 39, 38, 40, and so forth. He makes that claim. So I think maybe he's right about that. And even if he is right, and if he's right, then I guess I would grant that perfect culpability isn't quite possible. Given our finite capacity to think through issues, we're not always in the know. We don't always understand what we're doing and what sort of consequences our actions will have, and so forth and so on. But I want to think through this just a wee bit. Is perfect culpability a requirement for a necessary requirement for eternal punishment in hell? Well, look, I don't think so. I think what may be required is simply sufficient culpability. I made a few notes here, so I'm just going to read them because I can't quite remember what I wrote. But anyway, I say, suppose that a person sinned against God without perfectly knowing what they were doing, and further suppose that they were given ample opportunity to remedy their ignorance, but they refused. Okay, so as my reasoning here goes, suppose that a person sinned against God without perfect culpability, and therefore they're judged. But let's suppose that God intervenes and says, well, wait a second, you acted ignorantly, you acted without knowledge, and because you're finite, you're not going to have perfect knowledge of every situation. But I'm going to help you out. I'm going to enlighten you, say through the cross. I'm going to enlighten you through the Holy Spirit. So that you can have better culpability for your actions. You're ignorant now, but I'm going to give you some wisdom and some light to help you think through your actions. But I'm only going to give it to you if you freely want that, right? And let's suppose in this scenario, in this thought experiment, that the person says, nope, I don't want it. I want to maintain my ignorance. Well, if that's the case, if they were offered a remedy for their ignorance and their lack of perfect culpability or whatever, then and suppose they rejected that, would not, even in that situation, that person still deserve eternal punishment, or at least punishment for as long as they maintained their obstinate wills of ignorance, right, and irrationality. It seems that so long as they eternally persist in their will for ignorance, then it seems coherent to say that God is right and just to give them eternal punishment, right? Yeah, so let's think this through. It seems that DBH is okay with punishment. He's okay even with hell. He says he believes in hell so long as it's remedial, right? And then that end has an end to it, right? Hell has an end to it. Well, presumably he thinks that way because he understands that it's okay for God. He thinks it's just for God to punish the present sins of people, even though those sins, as he admits, are done out of ignorance and misapprehension and so forth and so on. So what I would like to push back and say, well, look, if you're okay with God punishing those present sins that are happening today, even though they're based on ignorance, if you're okay with God punishing them, so long as a person's maintaining their ignorance, then suppose that a person wants to maintain their ignorance in misapprehension and so forth and so on in every present moment that they encounter. In every subsequent present, suppose that God responds with each present moment that a person experiences sequentially through their eternal lives. Suppose that God just grants them continual punishment for their willful obstinance. So my point is that in my thought experiment, my characters don't have perfect culpability. But it seems that they have sufficient culpability such that they're saying no constantly, for all we know, eternally, in every subsequent present moment. They're saying no to the light and the wisdom that God is freely offering them. And as long as they say no for that period of time, however long it is, say eternally, then it's just for God to grant equal punishment for that. And again, I don't think DBH needs to rebut that, because even he believes that God can grant punishment for a person who, in their present state of life on earth, want to maintain their ignorance. I'm just saying, well, what if they want to maintain their ignorance for each subsequent present moment that they experience? In other words, for eternity. It seems to me that under that situation, you don't have perfect culpability, which he says is a requirement, but I'm showing that as long as you have sufficient culpability, that it's at least coherent, that God would render eternal punishment as a result of that.